So I'd like to welcome both of you, and I'll introduce you here in a moment, to Really Empowering Wealth. And this is really our second podcast in a series of three, where we've really tried to focus on women and wealth. And I'll introduce Keene first. Ellie joined me on the first podcast, and we had a 45-minute banter, which was fantastic. This podcast, we're trying to be a little bit more focused on the legal side, which is obviously our second guest, Kathleen. But Ellie, welcome back.
Thank you.
And just as a really quick introduction, Ellie's been in the business for 45 years, really, and 35 of that, and I'm probably not doing it justice, Ellie, but 35 of that is really advising clients, which obviously included women in wealth. So she's got a great background, not only as a female who's dealt with a lot of these issues, but obviously in the business of working and advising women. So welcome, Ellie, again for part two. And Kathleen is joining us. And thank you for joining us, Kathleen. And Kathleen is the legal bench tour, obviously a lawyer. And Kathleen, you've been, I think, called to the bar for 30 years. And again, fantastic background for us, which was very interesting from my perspective on this topic, because again, obviously being involved from a professional perspective, but obviously from a personal perspective as well. You've raised a family of three, and in there, you've obviously had a chance to do your craft in legal work, and you've changed a couple of times, given that you needed some flexibility as those kids grew up in the household. And so obviously, welcome both of you to our podcast and really empowering women to build wealth. I think the big question is really, why is financial independence important for women? And maybe Kathleen, I'll give you a chance to answer that question from your perspective.
Well, it's interesting through my work, and even with some personal experience. I deal with clients of all ages. And I think that for my younger clients, the problem has a lot to do with blended families and how to deal with that and how to manage that going forward. And with my older clients, it is, if you've been in a traditional family relationship, some of my clients find out after, say, their husband dies, that they don't have any credit, that they haven't had anything in their own name. And so on the flip side of that, I've had clients come in who are married and they don't realize that they don't really have an estate because everything that they have is joint, or, so that's another problem that's come up as well. So a lot of my clients across the array of ages need some education on joint assets versus having your own assets. And everyone needs their own assets. They need some assets in their name because they don't want to find out, like my mother did in her 80s, that she didn't have credit rating, because everything was in joint names and my dad was the primary earner. So she had to start with a credit card from a department store in order to build some credit, because nothing had been in her name for all those years alone. She bought things that had been in her name, but they weren't. I've had that issue come up with insurance, car insurance, something simple like that, where everything nothing's been in their name per se. And I've had clients who want to leave something to their children and don't realize that if they go first, there is nothing in their name because everything's been joint, and so there's a right of survivorship, and it just automatically transmits to the surviving joint tenant. So they really don't have an estate that they can leave to other people or children from a first marriage or that sort of thing.
Yeah,
that comes up a lot.
That's great, and then that's a great point in the sense that Ellie and I had talked about that last time as well, sort of and we kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ellie, we sort of looked at the different generations, yes, right? And how it is different. And maybe Ellie, comment on that a little bit, on maybe piggyback on Kathleen, sort of the surprise and maybe not being as involved, because you and I had a pretty good conversation about how the different generations, it has changed.
Yes. Well, and to go back to your original question, why is financial independence important? All of those circumstances that Kathleen just noted, I experienced as a financial advisor with clients dealing with either extended families or a young couple. But I think the primary reason, it's confidence. and confidence to confidence, and that you have that confidence at various stages of your life, as a young woman, as a senior, and that you are able to make good decisions, and you have got that healthy mindset, and you're not going to be faced with these surprises, some of which Kathleen just outlined, like, what? I don't have a credit rating? I've been paying the bills for 50 years and you don't know who I
Right.
am? How is that possible?
Oh.
And just the fact that your name doesn't necessarily appear on the utilities bill, but you've been in that same house for 30 years, but they don't know who you are. And
Yeah. It's
they're
almost like you start
questioning your ability to pay the utility bill.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. It's almost like, to both of your point, it almost feels like you'd start from scratch again after all those years. You
Are definitely
start from
starting from
zero.
scratch. Yeah.
And I actually sort of identified from what I've seen in our practice, when you look at and access to credit or less access to credit was one of the pieces that I have identified after 30 years in the business from the female, living in that same household. And then all of a sudden you have no access to credit. I mean, it's bang on what you guys are talking about, which is a fairly common piece. And so obviously a great reason why you'd want, that the financial independence. Now, here's a question to piggyback on the back of that. How do we stop that from happening? And it seems like an obvious question, but we've kind of laid out a couple of reasons why there should be independence for both people in the household, particularly the lady. How do you stop it from happening? How do we remedy this situation?
Well, education is one thing. I mean, and I do try to educate my clients when they come into the office to meet, but you know, it takes a lot to get them into the office in the first place. You don't see a lot of young people coming in, a lot of people in their 20s or even their early 30s coming in to do their estate planning because, the thing like, well, I don't have anything to give away. I don't have anyone to give it to. And I have to say that my clients without children and my single clients, especially females, they end up being the most complicated wills because once they start thinking about it,
Right.
it gets a lot more complicated. But education is the most important part of it. I've talked to many clients when they come in. We discuss one of the tests I have to ensure that my clients have the legal capacity to make financial decisions when they're writing their will. And some of the questions the simplest question to ask is, what do you have? And what they have, I have to explain the difference between joint ownership and sole ownership. And that's definitely surprising to some people. Younger clients, the best success I've had is involvement with some companies who've taken steps to, as part of the financial wellness of their clients. I know Matco's done that before. I've worked with companies and they do a holistic program, which can involve just some education and just some discussions with people. So I've been able to participate in that, in educating people on a wider scale, but it's not easy to get the word out. It usually is one-on-one in the office that some of these things are realized.
Right.
The most unfortunate way for people to get information, we'll probably hit on that later, is getting it from their neighbor, because that's usually pretty bad advice. And you end up being joint owners with someone you shouldn't be joint owners with. It's another way people do their own estate planning. My neighbor told me if I put one of my kids on my title, then we're not going to have to go through probate. We're going to save all kinds of money, which, the most you pay in probate fees in Alberta is $525. That's the maximum any estate over. So that's not a huge cost.
Right.
And instead, and you two will know better than I about the new reporting requirements to the CRA on bare trusts. Now people technically who are holding their, on their parents' title or on their parents' bank account as a bare trustee, they have an obligation to file returns, and there's penalties for not filing the returns, whether they owe taxes or not. So I think there's going to be some educating people on a rather urgent basis, I would think.
That's a whole other conversation.
It is.
Those new reporting rules, and we see it all the time now. And to be perfectly honest, Kathleen, most people don't have a clue
I
that
know.
those obligations are there. That's a whole pod. We'll put that aside. But that's a great point. And but But I know Ellie and I touched on this before with the education piece, and obviously that's what we're trying to do here, is because we recognize it as a big problem. Now, what we also, I think, arrived at is that generational difference, because if we look at clientele that we work, like I'm going to use the baby boomers, they seem particularly uneducated. I'm not going to say unwilling, but not as transparent in the household financial information. I find the young one, the millennials, actually really good. I don't find there's nearly the same gap. They seem to be quite a bit more dedicated to being knowledgeable and up to date. I don't know, Ellie, if you found the same thing.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think going back to your earlier point, I think that was just a sort of a societal expectation, and with stay-at-home moms, and that was a role that women weren't necessarily concerned with in the finances. They were busy looking after the family and everything that incorporated. But today, as we mentioned in our last chat, Jason, that women are more actively focused on their careers and maybe starting families a little later in life and advancing their careers, education, and going back for second and third degrees and more certificates, more certifications. So it's very important for them to have this understanding and this financial awareness, because they've got a lot invested in their personal careers. And chances are they're also doing that with a lot of debt. Getting the education isn't cheap, right? So it all comes with a big expense. When you finally landed your career job, okay, now let's take a look at this, because now I'm starting off, but I've got some debt behind me and I've got some catch up to make. So they're very motivated, very interested to have these discussions with financial advisors and the banks and figuring it out.
And Kathleen, what would be, I know it's difficult to pull sort of percentages of, but what would be I guess I have kind of two questions I'm curious about. One is, what percentage of your clientele would be younger individuals? You talked about sort of the single ones, or the versus the older. And then within that, what would be your view of women sort of driving the process?
Well, I'd say that out of when it comes to drafting or discussing estate planning with my clients, I'd say about 40% are nearing retirement or in retirement. They're at that age when if they have wills in place, they're changing it because their kids are old enough now to perhaps be named as an executor or an attorney under an enduring power of attorney. So you've got that, 65 to 75 year old coming in to update. They've got estate planning documents, but they've got now mature children, and they've got, say, a brother or a sister or somebody named as a trustee, and now they can have someone younger, which is another part of the education. Like, suddenly when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, becoming the executor of someone's estate, it's a big job. And a lot of work to do that people aren't necessarily prepared for. So that's a good chance, that's a good opportunity to reach out to those adult children to say, give them some information on what's involved being the trustee. And that sometimes is prompting them to start thinking about their own estate planning. The other, I'd say another 40% is in that 30, so we're paying 30 to 40, and we're having children now. We need to have, like, the guardianship issue is that brings them into the office, and then we get into a deeper discussion about assets. So I'd say 40% of my clients are having children, and 40% of my clients are at an age where their children are adults, so they're changing documents. And then you've got a little bit, about 20% of some, the very rare younger person who is just just really dedicated to making sure that their financial and legal health is all up to date. They're very organized. Where their parents have been through something in their own family is often an impetus for someone to come in, because they've been through the experience and know that their kid should have a will, their kid should have an enduring power of attorney or a personal directive.
But interesting, like I think if I kind of read through that, it sounds like you don't see them unless it's sort of catalyst driven. Something's happened, whether it be health, retirement. I'm going to use me and my wife as a catalyst. We're going on a trip.
Yeah.
for the
Going on
last minute.
holidays is very good, popular
We're both
time to
getting
come
on
in.
an airplane, and we need our wills redone. But it's interesting. It comes back to your education piece, where it seems like the estate side doesn't get done unless there's a catalyst that sort of pushes them your way, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 80% of the time I'd say there's a catalyst, and it's usually children coming of age, having children, or being through some life experience that has said, oh boy, it's really important to have these documents in place. You know, they had to go to court, for example, to be named a guardian, you know, a legal guardian or a legal trustee for a dependent adult. You know, once you meet those documents, it's too late to have them drafted. You know, you
Yeah.
have to go to court. Way more expensive
Yeah.
if you have to do it that way. But yeah, there's definitely a catalyst. There's something that has prompted them to come in.
Right.
And
so
and vacations are definitely one of them.
right.
Very common.
Well, I think you saw me, Kathleen. We were going on a trip last year.
I just had someone call yesterday. Oh, we're going to Mexico on Thursday, and we realized our wheels are way out of date. Can you do it before Thursday?
I'm coming clean, Alison. I'm coming clean here. That's so the other interesting piece that we've kind of talked around as well from a women's perspective is I've talked about the retirement savings gap. I've talked about longer life expectancy because, you know, I just look at my own personal experience. If I look at, you know, in our family, when you have, you know, my father has passed, my grandfather passed before my grandmother. If you look sort of from the perspective of life cycle, men don't live as long. I mean, if you walk into an assisted living home where my mother is right now, for example, it's kind of 80% women.
Men are very popular.
I guess if you live that long as a man, you do okay, right? Maybe there's a chance.
True.
But from the perspective of women, I mean, the money needs to last longer too. I mean, that's a
Mhm.
real, you know, Alison, we didn't really touch on it, but maybe I'll turn that over to you from your perspective of walking through with your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, historically, yes, women have outlived their partners, and definitely in their life cycle, they accumulated less wealth personally because they had less time working. Or in, you know, going back to our grandparents era, I don't think my grandmother, she didn't work after she got married and started raising the family. So, and yes, my grandfather, her husband, passed away when he was 65, and she went on to
Yeah.
live till she was 85. So there was a whole 20 years without him living a whole other life. So thankfully, pensions and savings kicked in. Today, men are living longer now. The stats even prove that. So the whole wealth planning, especially for life after work, retirement, is become even more important. And it's even more important to start that younger now than it was years ago.
Well, I think it's unbelievably important because I mean I look back even 2 generations ago. I mean, people worked sort of historically till 65. They got the gold watch, and then honestly, they planned for maybe 10 years of life after that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was, and now we see clients looking to retire at 55,
Mm-hmm.
but their life expectancy is a lot longer. Like, so if we look at pressure on assets from our perspective, the pressure on your assets, I think, is actually, that gap is growing where you've got less years of work, but you've got a lot more years of it. That's kind of what we notice when we're looking at, you know, putting plans together, retirement plans and projections. It's a lot more pressure on assets because people are living longer and want to retire sooner. Right.
Well, that's very true. And going back to when we were just having our preliminary chit chat earlier, Jason, when we were talking about skiing, last week I met a couple on the ski hill, and he was in his 70s and she was in her he was in his 80s and she was in her late 70s, and they're skiing. Now, the good news is when you get to that age, you get a severe discount, a real nice discount on your ski pass. But the point being is that they're still skiing.
Right.
And they didn't live here. And so they traveled to be here. So in generations gone by, retirement looked like you stayed home and looked after the grandchildren, right? And that was your job, and that was grandma's job, because grandpa probably wasn't still with us anymore. But today, the retired generation of today is traveling, or they're taking their family on a holiday, spending that kind of money, and creating those special moments. So I think retirement going forward is going to look a lot different for even the younger generations than it does even right now, which looks a lot different than it did for those previous generations.
Yeah. And Kathleen, maybe from to be a bit more granular, like, is there certain common denominators you see, what I call sort of train wreck examples, that you kind of see people coming into your office? I mean, Ellie and I were looking at sort of some of these pitfalls last time. Is there, from your perspective, what do you see? I mean, people are always interested in these stories. I mean, obviously we can't use any names, of course, but I mean, are there certain things that you see where you're fixing issues that people didn't do the proper planning?
Yes, when they try and do their own wills.
Oh yeah, the $6 Google will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a client who brought in her father's will. She prefaced it by saying, "My father hated lawyers." I don't know why her father hated lawyers. But as a result, he paid lawyers a lot more than he needed to fix all the problems. He thought he had taught himself how to write a proper will, but he didn't have a residual community executor. And he said, he said, "I made designations of my RIF and my pension, all these sorts of things. And so my daughter's my executive." And I'm like, well, he still has bank accounts. There's no residuary clause. There's no residuary beneficiary. So
Right.
and plus he made a formal will because he typed it up. The minute you type up a will, it becomes a formal will. And there are these formalities that have to be proven in order for it to be probated. So if you don't know what the formalities are and you miss out on them and you don't include them, then whoever probates your will is going to have to make another application. It's going to cost thousands of dollars when you could have spent a lot less than that and done a proper will. It's just everything.
Yeah.
There are many disastrous wills that you have to fix. I've had wills written on the back of fax paper. I've probated wills. I probated a will recently that was, a holograph will that was written in 1963. It's really well done. Like, he did a great job because he did it exactly according to how you need to do a holograph will. And it was easy to probate, but it just more people, because of the internet, they're trying to generate their own formal wills. And if you're much better off handwriting something, because then you can fit into the holograph rules. But if you start getting into formalities, then you have to have the formalities. And that's where people tend to create a bit of a train wreck, for sure. The other thing would be, the other train wrecks I see are folks not fully understanding, like the joint bank accounts and the joint names on titles. It can, if you read a lot of case law around undue influence or these sorts of things, it's because mom or dad heard from the neighbor. It's going to be much easier if we add the kids to the bank accounts, and then they can just disperse the money. Well, it looks on the surface like you are trying to call back account holders so you have a right to survivorship. It's now my bank account. I hear that very frequently. And it's meant for me to have all the money in that bank account. That's why she put me on. So I tell my clients that that's not the best way to estate plan. It's, it doesn't, in Alberta right now, it takes 2 weeks to get a granted probate if you have a proper will. 2 weeks. And I constantly have clients come in and say, "Oh, I've heard probate takes forever. It takes years. So-and-so didn't get their money for 2 years." That's not because how long it takes to get a grant of probate from the Court of King's Bench of Alberta, or pretty much any court in Canada. It's the final tax returns and clearance certificates that take time.
Right.
There's nothing that you can do about that by putting your kids' names on a title or your kids' names on your bank account. That's what causes the most problems when people try I want to save a few $100 and add someone to this bank account, add someone to title. They create tax issues. They make it more expensive to probate. It's just, not just trying to drum up business. It's going to save your executor and you time and frustration in the end.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Ellie, you've seen this many times as well. Like what I see is what actually can be quite dangerous is this putting joint ownership on big assets, whether it be a principal residence, when you have a primary principal residence tax exemption, right, which is a problem, could be a problem, and also
Yeah.
large investment accounts with all these capital gains.
Yes.
People don't understand that when you make some of those moves, it's actually a tax event. And we see that all the time with people asking about putting grandma on different accounts. I'm sure, Ellie, you've run into that many times as well, and in your many years in the business as well, where they try and shortcut for some reason. But that's education, right? That's the education piece that both of you talked about. Is for some reason people think in Alberta there's a huge cost in these huge time issues, and that's that education piece that I think is so key for everybody. But again, today talking more about women, but that's super important.
Yeah, we keep coming back to that in our first conversation, Jason, and now this one. It's the education about financial awareness and financial planning and budgeting and having your investment assets properly allocated and set up for needs down the road. And then here it is again, education piece about what life looks like after, and it's not really as hard as everybody likes to make it out to be. It's really just not that difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
and really when you think about the time spent, Kathleen, in your office, for example, and it's done. And you can walk away and go on that holiday, not necessarily by Thursday,
Yeah.
but you can walk away and it's done. And, for all intents and purposes, unless there are any major changes, you're good for 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Go back and see
Yeah.
Kathleen in 5 years from now and say, yeah, this has changed or that's changed, for you, and you're good for another 5 years. It's just the time spent relative to the benefits gained for your family. I don't really understand why there's a hesitation.
Well, that's why we're doing this, is because there shouldn't be, right? There should be no hesitation, but
No.
there is.
There should not be.
And another piece, Kathleen, that I'm interested in sort of picking your brain is marriage contracts. Not just for the younger, but also for the boomers or all the way through the piece. Have you seen an increase in marital contracts?
I wish I had, because a lot of my clients is that it's a blended family. It's a second marriage.
Right.
She has kids, he has kids, and they make a joint will where they leave everything to the other. And I have to sit there and go, when
Right.
one of you passes away, the other one can change it. And like they all, then they do a gift to each other, like a nuclear traditional family. Like say my husband's in my family, I leave everything to him. Something happens to him, it's divided amongst my 3 children in equal shares, etc. And so I had a lot of blended families come in, and I leave everything to my wife, and then gift over after she dies to all of our children, my children and her children. Unless you have a properly drafted marriage contract or testamentary contract, which is a lot like a marriage contract, you can't enforce that first will. They can go change it a week later if they want
Right.
to.
Right.
You walk down the street. I know someone that did. She went to a
Right.
joint will with her. It was her third husband, and for him it was the second wife. And then she, not that long after, wrote another will. So he died thinking that they had these mirror wills.
Right.
And in
Right.
fact, she had left everything to someone else where he had 3 children. And so it was a rude awakening. And it's a hard conversation to have two people who are, they're not having, I'm not a family law lawyer, they're not having any issues, but I have to say, because I've had people come in after one of their spouses have died and said, well, our original wills, we left everything after both of us died to my kids and his kids. His kids have been terrible to me. They've been mean. They've stolen stuff from the house. They've done this and that. Can I rewrite my will? And is there anything without a testamentary contract in place? Yeah, we can. And those, as a result, but I'm sure that's not what her husband had in mind when they did the
Right.
first set of wills. So it's very important to have that frank conversation with them. Sometimes people don't want to talk about things falling apart after someone dies, but money does strange things to people, and there's a lot of emotion when someone passes away, and a lot of emotion after someone passes away, but I think especially so in a blended family, things can fall apart quickly.
And for the younger women, because a lot of the younger women now I find making, the professionals, certainly that we see, they're making their own money. They probably have more independence than sort of the older generations have or had. Is your advice to them to get marital contracts or cohab agreements, or is that kind of your standard advice, or is it sort of on a one-off unique basis?
Yeah, with younger families, it does come up. It comes up when they consider a gift over. With young families, they travel together, so you have to discuss what we call a family demise clause or an ultimate beneficiary. It's like, you've got two young kids, but you guys go on trips together all the time. What happens if something terrible, in the unlikely event that something happens to all of you, and I've had a stage where that's happened, who do you want where they go? I never thought about that, and especially when they're traveling together frequently, I think you need to give that some thought. And that's when it sometimes comes up, well, what if I died first and my husband remarries and has more kids with somebody else? I don't want what I earned during my lifetime to go to his kids with his second wife. And so that does come up with younger families where there is no blended family, but they envision down the road that there could be a blended family. So there is an opportunity there. But, frankly, a lot of people don't want to spend the time and money to get the independent legal advice, because it is like a marriage contract where each person will need to get independent legal advice in order for it to be enforceable. And the hurdle that I face when I recommend that to people is the cost. They don't think it's necessary. If they've seen what's happened down the road in many of these instances, they might see it as time well spent and money well spent. But convincing people, it's like the first time I had to buy a vacuum cleaner, I knew I needed it, but did I want to spend that much money on something that I needed to do something I didn't enjoy doing? And so people, especially younger people, if they're not professionals and, getting a nice 6-figure income, it's a lot of money. At the time, it's tough for them to fit into their budget. So to ask them if they're going to fit into their budget doing their estate planning, to suggest that they go one step further and do the marriage contract or a testamentary contract is usually, it's oftentimes out of the budget at that point in time. So that's my main hurdle. But at least I give them that advice and they're aware of the potential issues down the road.
We actually have a number of cases where the mom and dad or grandma and grandpa actually put in their estate documentation that they require kids or grandkids to have contracts in place to even inherit anything. And they don't do it because they're bad people. They do it to take the kids or grandkids to base, because you don't have a choice. Right?
Yeah.
Because often you see in the heat of the moment when people get together, I mean, what can possibly go wrong when we're madly, this relationship is going fantastic. And those are hard conversations to have for young people that really don't have the maturity to have them. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how we've been kind of going up the ladder, up the hierarchy in the family to say, actually, it might not be a bad plan if you've got something sort of percolating over here to force it so it takes pressure off of them, if that makes sense. I'm sure you guys have seen that as well.
I often get that question, especially from my elderly clients, not elderly, but their kids have married or whatever. And she goes, if something happens to my son, she's not going to get the money, is she? Like, the Howards are saying something, or her kids aren't going to get the money, are they? And it opens the door for that conversation about making sure their assets are protected. And in some, like in higher net worth clients, they're willing to, pay the legal fees associated with that planning. Although, you mentioned specifically women, and now, with my, even when they come because they have a young family and they just had children, oftentimes to have a woman that has built something before she decided to have children. She owned a house.
Right.
A lot of times they still own 2 homes. They still own the condo that one of them had, and then they moved into his house. And so there's still these assets that are in separate names. So they've got something to protect. And more oftentimes that's when they ask those questions, or they're more interested in those potential ways of solving those potential issues. a little more
Yeah.
open-minded about it in those
Yeah.
cases. But another, the other side of that is young women who are inheriting money. That's another thing that executors or lawyers who are acting for executors, you're not often acting for the beneficiaries. It's very important for them to protect, because inheritance is not matrimonial property. It's not up for division unless you put it into a joint bank account or you decide to pay off your mortgage with it and you do something, you plow it into a joint asset, then you lose some of that exemption. So that's another opportunity to discuss with younger people. You're coming into these funds right now. You should put them in your own name unless you want them to become part of the overall picture.
Yeah. So with us at sort of 37 minutes here, if I can give both of you a chance to answer this question, what advice would you give women today? And let's just start with young women. What advice would you give young women when we're looking at sort of promoting or wanting women to be independent wealth? Achieve independent wealth. What advice would either of you or both of you give them? And maybe Kathleen, you go first.
Well, I think especially women who have had a professional career and have assets going into the marriage, I'd always recommend a marriage contract because it's so much easier to work these things out when you are getting along. It's
Right.
when you're not getting along that it's very hard to work things. Even if compared even to a closely held private company, it's too late once everyone stops getting along to deal with something that you would have in a unanimous shareholders agreement. I sort of think of a marriage contract being like a unanimous shareholders agreement for your family. Let's work out we don't want this to be dissolved or end, but while we're civil and we both have assets, let's work it out now. And that's would be my number one piece of advice for a young woman who is doing her estate planning and financial planning, marriage contracts and or testamentary contracts in conjunction with wills. A lot of times now when someone is doing a marriage contract, they'll do the estate planning at the same time. So that's all part of the package, so that we're referring to the wills, etc.
Alison?
Yeah, I would agree with what Kathleen said. I mean, these are very difficult conversations to have even at the at the peak of your
Yeah.
relationship. And it's interesting that when we reflect on it years ago, it was just understood that women were going to sign these contracts before you got married. If you were marrying into a wealthy family or marrying a partner who had done quite well for themselves at that early stage of life, you're just, the piece of paper was slid across, like you're going to just sign it without any questions asked. But now when the discussion comes up, I find that it's it's not as congenial. Like, men, you just not going to slide that piece of paper over to your partner and have him sign it without any questions asked. It's almost a bit of bruising of the ego, so to speak. Like, what do you mean? You think I'm going to try and take any of your assets away?
Right.
Why would you think that? I love you. Well, it's life circumstances. Stuff happens. Premature deaths, all of a sudden, and they're faced with these very unusual circumstances that they had no thought of being there. But these are difficult decisions, and I think cohabitation agreements definitely, where you're finding partners coming together in their mid-30s, 40s, and they've got a condo and a home and wonderful careers, and they've accumulated assets, portfolios, and it's what's mine is mine and yours is yours, and what we build together is ours. But if this relationship were not to last forever, then I should be able to, rely on what was mine, and you should be able to rely on what was yours. And if there's children involved, then that's a different conversation. But I've seen it where, in fact, the woman, the female partner did quite well, and then the relationship didn't go well, and then now she's providing spousal support, and she's lost half of her assets in the divorce. And it's like, that's an interesting scenario watching that play out, because they were at the same stage of life, and he hadn't given up his career to bring up the family or anything. There wasn't that circumstance involved. But because there wasn't a marriage contract, those assets were on the table and up for grabs.
Yeah. And that was kind of my, when I started going down the road, that was kind of what started to dawn on me with many of our younger clients, professionals, is that we were seeing a lot of women in a compromised position. That was kind of the preface of this. And I don't think a lot of people quite understand that. There's sort of this notion that it's a one-way street, but it actually isn't. And,
Exactly.
And if I was to extrapolate or drive forward, another 10 or 20 years, I think it just gets worse, right? As sort of that generation of women come through that are working and that are, in many cases, making more money than their partner or the spouse, right? So we're kind of at the front end of this. And from my perspective, what we see now, the boomers, they've got their own issues. It's sort of a little bit different, but there's a younger generation driving through with different issues. And that's why I was kind of asking Kathleen about, are you seeing more marriage contracts? Because we are. Like, we're getting a lot more questions, and we're advising a lot of our young women, go get marriage put them in place. Put them in place. And if you don't put them in place, at least have a conversation with your legal assistant on why you should put them in place. I mean, we obviously in our position can't force them to do anything, but you can make sure that, come back to the education piece, have the conversation. Yeah. At least have the conversation and have someone tell you some stories on kind of what they're seeing out there. Anyways, I'm rambling on a little bit here, but I think it was great sort of banter on with both of you, sort of on the legal side of it, on the importance of it when young women and older, but younger women sort of making sure they're protected asset wise, all on that financial independence for women. Anyways, I could probably keep chatting for a long time with both of you. You guys got many years of experience, and obviously appreciate the time both of you have taken. But I think I've probably kept you long enough here at the 45 minute mark, and we are planning on having a third series of this as well. So stay tuned. But I sure appreciate both of your input, and I'll probably hit the stop record button here.